The tension was palpable. And the audience couldn't get enough. The producers, clearly recognizing they had struck gold, leaned into the family conflict. They orchestrated sit-downs, family meetings, and even in one of the most infamous storylines had Sadhna and Anil move in with Sumit and Jenny. This was a master stroke of reality television production. The close quarters proximity ignited a powder keg of passive aggression and outright hostility. We watched as Sadhna attempted to train Jenny to be a proper Indian daughter-in-law, criticizing her cooking, her cleaning, her very way of being. Every scene was dripping with tension, every interaction a micro-battle in a never-ending war. It was uncomfortable, it was compelling, and it cemented Sadhna's reputation as one of the most formidable villain-in-laws in the franchise's history. Through it all, Jenny and Sumit's love seemed to endure. They finally married in secret, terrified of the parental fallout. When the news inevitably came out, the explosion was as dramatic as everyone expected. There was more crying, more threats of disownment, more declarations that Jenny had stolen their son. Yet slowly, glacially, something seemed to shift. In recent seasons, we saw what appeared to be a thaw. The parents began to reluctantly accept the marriage, participating in family events, even sharing moments of begrudging peace with Jenny. The audience breathed a collective sigh of relief. It seemed the war was finally over. The villains had been, if not vanquished, then at least neutralized. The couple had their hard-won peace, and that is why the headline from that Indian newspaper was such a seismic shock. Parents sue reality TV star, son and American wife for defamation. It made no sense. The war was supposed to be over. The lawsuit filed in the High Court of Delhi was a sprawling emotional document. In it, Sadhna and Anil claimed their lives had been systematically destroyed by the television show. They alleged that Jenny and Sumit had conspired with producers from the very beginning to portray them as monstrous, cruel and unreasonable villains. They claimed that key conversations were edited out of context, that producers fed them lines and pushed them into confrontations, and that the constant negative portrayal had led to them being ostracized from their community. They were seeking millions in damages for defamation and the intentional infliction of emotional distress. The news spread like wildfire through the day fan community. Online forums and social media platforms became battlegrounds. Had we been duped? Was Sadhna not a manipulative matriarch but a loving mother pushed to her breaking point by television producers? Was Anil not a cold, disapproving father, but a dignified man whose reputation was ruined for ratings? The narrative was completely flipped on its head. For a moment, it seemed possible that the real villains of this story were not the parents, but the show itself, and perhaps even Jenny and Sumit for their complicity. But then the counter-narrative began to emerge. It started as a whisper, a rumor on an obscure message board, a cryptic comment from a deleted social media account. And then it solidified into a full-blown leak. A story so explosive it made the initial lawsuit look like a minor skirmish. The source was identified as a fired production assistant with an axe to grind. Someone who had been there from the early days and had finally decided to break their silence. This source didn't just refute the parents' claims, they obliterated them, revealing a conspiracy that was darker and more cynical than anyone could have possibly imagined. This is where the story turns from a family drama into a high-stakes thriller. This is the twisted, real story. According to this insider, the lawsuit filed by Sadhna and Anil was a complete and utter sham. Calculated, manipulative piece of legal theatre designed for one purpose and one purpose only. The source alleged that from the very beginning, Sadhna and Anil were not the unwilling, exploited participants they claimed to be. They were not victims, they were contractors. The production company, realizing the immense potential of the disapproving parent storyline, had allegedly approached them with a secret deal, an offer they simply couldn't refuse. This wasn't a standard appearance release form that all reality show participants signed. This was something different, something a veteran producer on the show had nicknamed the Continuing Antagonist Agreement. It was a contract that essentially put Sadhna and Anil on the payroll as the show's recurring villains. The details of this alleged agreement, as leaked by the source, were breathtaking in their cynicism. The contract guaranteed them a payment of $1 per episode, in which they appeared and played a significant role in the storyline's conflict. Think about that for a moment. Over a decade of appearances across multiple seasons and spin-offs, that base fee alone would have amounted to a substantial figure sum. But it gets worse. The contract also included a detailed bonus structure for delivering high-conflict scenes. The source claimed to have seen a schedule of these bonuses. A tearful confrontation. Assume it. A potential dollar bonus. An explosive argument with Jenny that could be used in the season's promotional trailer dollar bonus. A threat of disownment or legal action delivered with sufficient emotional gravity. A dollar bonus. Their disapproval wasn't just real, it was financially incentivized their pain. The performance. And they were paid handsomely for every heart-wrenching scene. The most twisted part of this entire alleged conspiracy. Jenny and Sumit were kept completely in the dark. According to the source, the antagonist agreement was a side deal, a secret pact between the production and the parents. Jenny and Sumit were led to believe that every fight, every tear, every threat was % genuine. They were living in a manufactured reality, a Truman Show-esque nightmare where the central antagonists and their life story were not just family, but paid actors. This revelation, if true, reframes everything. It means that the emotional toll on Jenny and Sumit was horrifyingly real. Sumit's agony. His feeling of being torn between his parents and his love was genuine. He was being psychologically manipulated by his own parents for a paycheck. Jenny's despair, her years of feeling unwanted and disrespected. Her constant fear of being forced to leave the country and the man she loved, all of it was real for her. She was the unwitting co-star in a drama where the villains knew the script and she was left to improvise her pain. Think back to all those iconic scenes. Sadhna moving into their home, her constant nitpicking and criticism of Denny's lifestyle. Was that a concerned mother trying to help, or was she trying to hit a performance metric for a bonus? Remember the astrologer who declared them a bad match? A scene that caused Jenny so much distress was that. Genuine consultation? Or was the outcome predetermined, a plot point negotiated by the parents and producers to heighten the drama? Remember the screaming matches? The ultimatums, the door-slamming exits? Were we watching a family crumble or were we watching a business transaction being fulfilled? According to this insider, Sadhna and Anil weren't just participants, they were masters of the game. They understood their role perfectly and knew that the more drama they created, the more screen time they would get and the more money they would make. They were, in essence, selling their son's happiness episode by episode. This brings us back to the central question. If they were being paid, and had been for years, why sue now? Why risk exposing this entire arrangement with a public lawsuit? The answer, according to the source, lies not in a quest for justice, but in a breathtaking display of greed. The lawsuit was simply step one in a much larger, much more lucrative plan. The source then leaked the second bombshell, a book proposal that Sadhna and Anil had been secretly shopping to major publishers in India and abroad. The proposal was for a tell-all memoir and the title was a masterpiece of manipulative branding. Our Son, Our Shame, A Mother's Agony. It promised to tell the real, untold story of their suffering, to expose the truth about Denny's influence over their son, and to detail their heartbreak as they watched their family be torn apart on global television. It was positioned as a victim's manifesto and publishing houses were biting. The source claimed that the parents had already secured a verbal agreement with a major Indian publisher for a $1 million advance, a life-changing sum of money. But there was one massive obstacle standing in their way, their television contract. That secret antagonist agreement allegedly contained a non-disclosure agreement, an NDA that was described as lifetime and unbreakable. It was an ironclad clause that prohibited them from ever speaking about the production, their financial arrangements, or the reality of the show. If they published the book, they would be in immediate breach of that contract and the production company would sue them into oblivion. They would lose their $advance and likely be forced to pay millions more in damages. They were trapped by the very deal that had made them secret reality TV stars. And so their legal team devised a cynical and brilliant strategy. They couldn't just break the NDA, they had to invalidate it. Their lawsuit against Jenny and Sumit was the key. The strategy was to argue in court that they were coerced and manipulated from the beginning. They would claim they were simple, naive people who were taken advantage of by a powerful American production company and their own son. They would argue that the contract they signed, the antagonist agreement, was unconscionable and signed under duress, and therefore the NDA contained within it should be rendered null and void. If a judge agreed and invalidated the NDA, they would be free. Free to publish Our Son, Our Shame. Free to cash their $check. The lawsuit wasn't a search for truth, it was a golden key designed to unlock a much bigger treasure chest. They weren't suing for defamation because their feelings were hurt. They were suing for defamation as a legal crowbar to pry open their NDA. It was a breathtakingly audacious gamble using the justice system itself as a tool to execute their final, most profitable performance. When news of this alleged scheme reached Jenny and Sumit, their world, which had already been turned upside down by the initial lawsuit, was shattered into a million pieces. The sense of betrayal was profound and absolute. It wasn't just that their parents had lied to the public. It was that they had been lying to them, to their own son, for a decade. Every argument, every tearful plea, every moment of supposed reconciliation was now tainted, recast as a cynical performance for money. The emotional torment that Sumit had endured. The years he spent trying to broker peace between the two warring sides of his life was all based on a lie. He had been a pawn in his own parents' financial game. For Jenny, the realization was just as devastating. The woman who had made her life a living hell, who had made her feel inadequate and unwelcome in her own home, had been doing it for cash. The cruelty wasn't just emotional, it was transactional. Feeling doubly betrayed, first by the performance and now by the lawsuit designed to profit from that performance, Jenny and Sumit knew they couldn't stay silent. They had to fight back. With the help of a top-tier legal team, they filed a massive countersuit. A legal document that was not just a defense, but an all-out declaration of war. Their countersuit didn't just deny the parents' claims, it laid bare the entire alleged conspiracy for the court to see. It contained key allegations. First, breach of contract and fraud filed against Sadhna and Anil. They argued that by shopping and securing a deal for their tell-all book, the parents were already in violation of the NDA. They were trying to break the fraud claim was even more personal, alleging a decade-long scheme to defraud them emotionally and financially by pretending their conflict was real. Second, they filed for an invasion of privacy. This was a direct strike against the book itself. They sought an injunction to prevent the publication of Our Son, Our Shame, arguing that it contained knowingly false, fabricated, and deeply personal attacks designed to humiliate them for profit. They were not just trying to stop a book. They were trying to protect themselves from a final public assassination of their character and road they alleged conspiracy. This was the allegation that tied it all together. They claimed that the parents' initial lawsuit was not a legitimate legal claim, but a bad faith maneuver. A cynical abuse of the legal process concocted with their lawyers for the sole purpose of enriching themselves. Through the book deal, the legal battle lines were drawn on one side, Sadhna and Anil playing the role of aggrieved victims, on the other, Jenny and Sumit fighting for their truth, their reputation, and to expose a deception that had defined their lives for long years. The stage was set for a courtroom drama that would make their television show look like child's play. The discovery process began and the secrets that had been buried for a decade were about to be unearthed, damning document at a time. The entire reality TV world held its breath, waiting to see which version of reality would prevail. The legal process, often a slow and grinding affair, transformed into a media circus. Every filing, every motion was leaked to the press and devoured by a public hungry for the next chapter in this real-life soap opera. Sadhna and Anil's lawyers were masters of public relations, painting their clients as elderly victims, traditionalists who were chewed up and spat out by the ruthless machine of American reality television. They gave tearful interviews to Indian news channels, speaking of their shame and heartbreak. Their performance is more convincing than ever now that they were on a national stage. But behind the scenes, in the sterile environment of legal discovery, their carefully constructed narrative was beginning to crumble. The first crack in their dam of lies came from the production company. Subpoenaed by Jenny and Sumit's legal team, They had no choice but to comply. They fought to have the document sealed, citing proprietary business practices. But the judge, sensing the public interest and the core relevance to the case, refused. And so it was entered into evidence, a scanned copy of a document titled, "Simply Continuing Antagonist Agreement. The Smoking Gun." There it was, in black and white. Signed by both Sadhna and Anil Singh. The contract laid out the entire deception in cold legalistic language. It detailed the per-episode payment schedule. It outlined the bonus structure for high-conflict scenes, emotional breakthroughs, and storyline-furthering ultimatums. It even contained clauses about wardrobe and travel stipends for appearing on tell-all specials. It was not a contract for a participant in a documentary. It was a contract for a performer in a drama series. In the courtroom, the moment the document was presented, a visible shift occurred. Sadhna and Anil's lawyers objected furiously, but the judge overruled them. The paper was projected onto a screen for the court to see. The signatures were undeniable. For Jenny and Sumit, it was a moment of vindication and profound sadness, seeing the cold, hard proof of their family's betrayal. The monetization of their pain was devastating. Sumit, in particular, looked utterly broken. The decade of turmoil, of believing he was the cause of his mother's tears and his father's disappointment, was a lie. He hadn't been breaking their hearts. He had been affecting their income. Their disapproval was a commodity they had been selling to the highest bidder, and he, their son, was the product. The facade of the victimized parents was shattered. They were not victims, they were employees. But the worst was yet to come. The antagonist agreement proved the financial motive, but Jenny and Sumit's lawyers wanted to prove malice to show that the parents' plan went beyond just cashing in. It was about actively destroying them for a good story. And that proof lay within the pages of Our Son, Our Shame. As part of the discovery for the invasion of privacy claim, the publisher was forced to turn over the early drafts of the manuscript. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect, a self-pitying, biased retelling of the events we had all seen on TV, filled with embellished stories of their own suffering. But one chapter, buried deep in the manuscript, went somewhere so dark, so vile, that it left the courtroom in stunned silence. The chapter was titled "The Serpent in Our Home." In it, Sadhna and her ghost-written voice recounted the period when she and Anil had moved in with Jenny and Sumit. She described her growing unease not just with Denny's housekeeping, but with what she called her predatory American nature. And then came the fabrication, a lie so grotesque and defamatory it was clearly created for no other reason than pure shock value. The manuscript alleged that one evening Sadhna had walked into the living room to find Jenny making inappropriate and unwanted advances towards Sumit's father, Anil. The book described in lurid detail how Jenny had supposedly cornered him, whispering suggestive things, and how the noble Anil had been forced to push her away and disgust. It was a complete and utter fabrication, a disgusting lie designed to paint Jenny not just as an unsuitable wife, but as a sexually deviant predator targeting her own father-in-law. This was the point of no return. This lie revealed the true depth of their cynicism. It wasn't about telling their truth. It was about creating the most scandalous, headline-grabbing narrative possible to sell books. They were willing to accuse Jenny of a monstrous act to humiliate their own family patriarch Anil by making him a character in this sordid fantasy, all for the sake of a juicier chapter. It proved beyond any doubt that their lawsuit and their book were born of malice. They weren't trying to reclaim their reputation, they were trying to annihilate Jenny's. This single fabricated passage sealed their fate. It was no longer a question of who was telling the truth, it was a question of how severely the liars would be punished. The final day in court arrived. The judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman who had listened to weeks of testimony with an impassive expression, was ready to deliver her ruling. Sadhna and Anil sat with their lawyers, still attempting to project an aura of wounded dignity. Jenny and Sumit sat together holding hands, their faces etched with a mixture of anxiety and exhaustion. The judge cleared her throat, looked down at Sadhna and Anil, and delivered a verbal rebuke that was more brutal than any television confrontation they had ever filmed. Her ruling was a complete and total victory for Jenny and Sumit. First, she addressed the parents' defamation case. She dismissed it with prejudice, a legal term meaning it could never be filed. But she didn't stop there. She called their lawsuit a shameful and frivolous abuse of the justice system. She accused them of perpetrating a brazen fraud upon the public, the network, and most tragically, their own son. She stated that they were not victims of defamation, but architects of deception. And that they had come to her court not seeking justice, but seeking to profit from their own lies. It was a complete and utter legal demolition. Next, she turned to Jenny and Sumit's countersuit. She ruled decisively in their favor on all counts. She issued a permanent worldwide injunction against the publication of Our Son, Our Shame. The book was dead. No publisher anywhere in the world could ever legally print it. The dream had evaporated. But the judge's final blow was the one that would ensure their scheme would end not in profit, but in ruin. She addressed the matter of legal fees, citing the parents' bad faith litigation and the malicious fabrications in their manuscript. She ordered Sadhna and Anil to pay for Jenny and Sumit's entire legal defense. The final bill was staggering. The very lawsuit they had concocted to make had instead saddled them with a crippling figure debt. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The publisher, upon learning of the injunction and the fraudulent nature of the book's contents, immediately terminated their contract and filed their own lawsuit against Sadhna and Anil to claw back the hefty advance they had already been paid. News headlines in India, which had once painted them as sympathetic figures, now branded them as frauds and manipulators. They were publicly humiliated, their names synonymous with a failed greedy scheme, in one fell swoop. Their attempt at payday had left them disgraced, ostracized and financially devastated. The final scene of their reality TV career was not one of tearful reconciliation or dramatic confrontation, but the cold, harsh reality of financial ruin and public shame. They had gambled everything on one great performance and they had lost spectacularly. So what does this all mean? This story, this tell-all betrayal, does more than just close the book on one of Fiancé's longest-running sagas. It shatters the very lens through which we watch these shows. It fundamentally breaks the wall. Tapping into that question, every single viewer has whispered to themselves how much of this is actually real. In this case, the answer was more complex and disturbing than we could have imagined. The conflict was real for some and a paid performance for others, creating a cruel psychological experiment played out for our entertainment. This revelation completely redefines the entire story of Sumit and Jenny. Every scene we have ever watched is now recontextualized. The disapproving mother wasn't just a mother, she was a paid antagonist. The silent, stoic father wasn't just a father, he was a supporting actor. This reframing makes Jenny and Sumit the ultimate victims. They weren't just battling cultural norms or family disapproval. They were unwitting protagonists in a manufactured drama, emotionally manipulated not just by producers, but by the two people Sumit should have been able to trust the most. They were gaslit on a global scale for a decade. And finally, it gives us a truly modern and relevant villain. The evil here wasn't traditionalism or clash of cultures. The villain was greed. It was the hunger for fame and money. A hunger so powerful that Sadhna and Anil were willing to sell out their own son, fabricate disgusting lies, and abuse the court system to get what they wanted. They are a cautionary tale for the age of reality TV, a perfect embodiment of the corrupting influence of seeking minutes of fame and book deal. Their betrayal wasn't just personal. It was a betrayal of the trust that we, the audience, place in the stories we are told, even the messy, complicated ones. Now I have to turn the final question over to you. Knowing that Sumit's parents may have been paid to be the villains all along, does this change how you feel about their entire story? Were we all just watching a performance? Let me know your shocking theory below.